We're going to start off by diving into last night's Monday Night Football thriller between the Atlanta Falcons and the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, you have probably seen the play by now. 1 minute and 46 seconds left in the game. The Eagles up by 3 points, 3rd and 3, and they decide to pass the ball. At this point, Falcons without a timeout, so no way to stop the clock. The Eagles decide to do a little rollout with Jalen Hurts to Saquon Barkley, and ultimately the play was scripted up beautifully. Saquon Barkley appeared to be wide open for an easy first down conversion, but he just couldn't bring it in. And I think that I'm really in the majority with what sounds like a lot of people's reactions are. And I just think that it is an awful decision to pass the ball in that situation. Now, in terms of an actual play design on a normal 3rd and short opportunity, I think that it is an excellent design there. Barkley was wide open in the flats. You also have Jalen Hurts rolling out in space to his right with the option to keep it himself. Obviously, Hurts keeping the ball himself was a very big part of the Eagles' game plan during last night's game, but I just think that it is inexcusable to run the risk of stopping the clock. And the reality is, in football, in all of sports, and in all of life, human error is just inevitable to some degree. And again, I think even opening the door of possibilities for the clock to stop there is a mistake. Now, you can start to play the hypothetical game in any which direction you may want to. If they end up running it there, the Falcons still get the ball back. They pretty easily drove down the field in 1 minute and 5 seconds. So you can try and make the argument that the Falcons would have scored anyways and the Eagles would have lost if they did in fact settle for the field goal, which, by the way, that's a whole nother conversation that people are talking about. Should the Eagles have gone for it on 4th and 3? I stand by the Eagles there. I think you got to take the points. You can't let a field goal beat you. That is... So I'm with the Eagles on that. It's just, again, all of this building up just led to a very disappointing loss for the Eagles. And you know what? Credit Kirk Cousins and the Falcons. We're going to be talking about them a little bit more in the second half of this segment here. It was an excellent drive there. But on the other end as well, while we're on the note, especially with the Eagles coaching, I thought that all in all, this entire game had a lot of causes for concern in the coaching game, which is really what one of the biggest questions surrounding the Eagles was headed into this season. And Nick Sirianni obviously getting the majority of the blame this morning, and rightfully so to some degree. I do feel like people are omitting the fact that Sirianni is no longer the play caller. Now, I'm sure as the head coach, he still has final say in a lot of it, but Kellen Moore is actually the play caller for the Eagles. Sirianni, because of the sort of turmoil that was built up during the second half of last season, he gave up those responsibilities. New coordinators on both sides of offense and defense. So I do think that Kellen Moore as well definitely deserves some of the blame, but of course it's going to fall back on Sirianni for whatever it's worth. But I really didn't think that the coaching all night was good for the Eagles. Like I mentioned, excellent drive for Kirk Cousins to have his first signature moment with the Falcons, but I had a couple issues with the way that the Eagles played this game defensively on that drive and in this game altogether, where why are you giving such large cushions to the Falcons in that situation? I understand you don't want to get beat over the top. You understand that a touchdown beats you. But that being said, Kirk Cousins, he did not attempt one pass the entire night that was past 20 yards from the line of scrimmage, and that there were a number of moments where we saw Cousins being a little bit more hesitant of actually taking that deep shot. The broadcast crew on ESPN highlighted at one point he had Ray McLeod early in the game for what should have been a wide open break. They ended up going to Drake London instead for what was a big gain, but I think that Kirk is still a little bit gun shy in terms of testing out his full physical capacity as he recovers from that torn Achilles injury. And ultimately, I just thought that sort of on that note as well, they should have been applying more pressure to Cousins. If you want to, obviously argue against that for the final drive, I'm with you. I'm not saying they had to blitz there necessarily, but throughout the game, they put no pressure on Kirk Cousins, who last week, when he faced pressure from the Pittsburgh Steelers, really struggled. And Vic Fangio, their new defensive coordinator, has a reputation over these past couple years that he does not like to blitz. The Dolphins were bottom 6 in blitz percentage last season. He did so actually ramp that up a little bit more in 2022 with the Broncos. They were top 4 in the league in blitz rate, but didn't pay off much. And in terms of the pressure stats or anything like that. So maybe that scared Fangio off, but through 2 games, the Eagles are currently 29th in the NFL in pressure rate and tied for last in yards per play allowed according to Football Reference, which is those are some really bad numbers. And again, if you want to play a little bit more conservative, I'm not saying through the entirety of the season that can't be more so your identity, but to not put any pressure on Kirk Cousins, I think is a mistake. And ultimately, the Eagles, in a number of different ways, sort of helped give this game to the Falcons. So just talk defensive game plan very quick on the offensive side of the ball. I think that it goes a little bit beyond the coaching itself. I didn't love the play calling for Philly in this game. It sort of piqued my interest on that first drive when they ran a QB draw on 3rd and 9. That was a little bit weird to me, and I think that it goes to speak a little bit that clearly the Eagles did not have all that much faith in their pass catchers. They were without A.J. Brown in this game, who's dealing with a hamstring injury, and they decided to go very heavy on the ground, understandably so. You have Saquon Barkley, and then Jalen Hurts also is still a very good runner. He rushed for 85 yards. I believe Saquon was at 95. So you got a really good rushing attack in this game, so that's great, but again, the 3rd and long decision to do that sort of piqued my interest. And then during the game as well, a lot of RPOs. RPOs are a very well utilized thing in the NFL and in the college game. So it's not like I'm frowning upon the decision to use RPOs, but whether it is on Jalen Hurts or on the coaching, they picked up at least 3 ineligible man downfield penalties, which is as a result of Jalen Hurts holding onto the ball too long and then deciding to throw downfield. That ultimately you have Cam Jurgens was really the main culprit in this situation, but there was at least one play where it was a couple linemen that went downfield. You got to throw the ball quickly there before your linemen are getting downfield. They can't just sit back and be passive because there's also a chance you're running right behind them. So I don't know if that's more of a coaching point or more on a Jalen Hurts decision-making thing, but it was just a messy game, I thought, for the Eagles on a number of instances there. That being said, they still should have won the game, so it's not like I'm trying to skewer them, and we're going to talk about the panic meter for the Eagles as well as all the other biggest teams that lost this weekend. I don't think you need to be entirely up in arms with the Eagles, but again, like I mentioned at the top of the show, for whatever it's worth, the Eagles coaching is sort of one of the bigger storylines with this roster. It is a very talented team, and to have that type of a showing, I think, is a good amount concerning. Now, on the other side, like I mentioned, want to give Kirk Cousins credit because ultimately this Falcons season seemed like it was going to be in a downward spiral, and the Eagles may have done them a huge favor on that 3rd down decision to help keep them alive because it seemed like Philly had it locked up. And, I was writing in my notes at the time during the watch where, well, the Falcons were still competitive in this game, and they could maybe look to build momentum, but assuming the Eagles were just able to close that one out, the Falcons would have fallen to 0-2 in a division where the New Orleans Saints and Tampa Bay Buccaneers have been two of the most impressive teams through 2 weeks, and to fall 0-2, that could have been potentially detrimental for their playoff hopes. And now instead, they get an incredible comeback win that sort of raises the morale of the entire team, sort of lifts the monkey off the back of Kirk Cousins, who seemed like he might have been getting booed out of Atlanta if things continued to go poorly. And then Raheem Morris, who I do just love as a coach, and I have very high expectations for him, but it would have been definitely disappointing to have the season start like this after they did gain so much momentum, it felt like, during the offseason. So, it wasn't a perfect game for them. I especially thought on the offensive side of the ball, the first half was shaky. But what we saw in the second half was sort of the recipe of success for this team. It was feeding Bijan Robinson and that run game. I especially loved the drive coming into the second half where they were running the ball with Bijan, playing off of that with the play actions, and then just get the ball in the hands of your best playmaker. They had a screen that went for a pretty significant gain there. And overall, I've just been really enthused with what I've seen from offensive coordinator Zach Robinson and what he's been able to do with this ground game so far. And that's really what their identity on offense should be if it's, firing on all cylinders. Kirk Cousins at this point, 36 years old, coming off of an Achilles tear, that it's feeding Bijan and running behind that offensive line that has been moving people up to this point, especially in the ground game. Haven't looked quite as good in the pass game, but ultimately, Bijan in this game, like I mentioned, feeding him 18 touches for 122 total yards, not to mention the fact that Tyler Algier is somehow already forgotten as a 1,000-yard rusher that he had in his rookie season just a couple years ago, and he's very capable of splitting reps with Bijan, so he had 53 yards on 9 carries. The two of them together averaged over 6.5 yards per carry, and then on top of that, you just have Kirk Cousins being the game manager that he's been for so long, but game manager is not a derogatory term towards quarterbacks. Sometimes it's just the style of play, and Kirk just making the right decisions. He was a little bit panicked and uncomfortable in week 1. Now, obviously, like I mentioned, part of that was as a result of the pressure that the Steelers were able to put on him versus what the Eagles were incapable of doing in this game. So we'll surely have to see sort of what Kirk looks like once he faces pressure once again. But he was, all things considered, pretty good in this game. 20 of 29, 241 yards, and 2 touchdowns with no interceptions. I think that's a good stat line for him, and I think that that is a winning recipe for the Falcons moving forward this season. Again, eventually Kirk will probably be tested in a couple different ways, but as for this game, I mean, he stepped up in the biggest moment, put together the game-winning drive. It was actually his, in the past 5 seasons now, 15 go-ahead touchdown passes in the fourth quarter and overtime, which leads the NFL. That's right, even over Patrick Mahomes, who just pulled off another one of those himself this past weekend. But all in all, I think that this is a very exciting win for the Falcons, who can hope to sort of, like I mentioned, build off of this and just stay alive in at least that divisional hunt, maybe in the playoff hunt as a whole. And on the other side, for the Eagles, I don't think you need to overreact. This is still a talented roster. We're TBD on the A.J. Brown injury. We're going to be circling back to that injury in particular later on in the show here, but it sounds like, he's going to miss a couple weeks. Even still, it is a talented team. I worry a little bit about the depth of the receiving core there, both wide receivers. I mean, Covey was the second leading targets leader in this game. Dallas Goedert wasn't very involved, so that's something that, again, game plan perspective, I think the Eagles are going to have to work on from here, be a little bit less reliant on Jalen Hurts using his legs maybe. But, defense, Question marks there, sure, to some degree, but I still think they're going to be an improved unit this year. First round pick Quinyon Mitchell, he had the tough moment on that game-winning drive where Darnell Mooney was able to shake him a little bit and pick up big yards, but he is eventually, I think, going to work his way back into it. Obviously, a huge difference in talent level that he's facing from his time at Toledo to the NFL, so he just needs to get acclimated a little bit more, but I think that he's going to be really good for them. Linebacker Zach Bonds seems like he may have been one of the most underrated signings of the offseason. Picking him up from New Orleans, putting him in a bigger role, and he currently leads the NFL in solo tackles through 2 games, so I've liked what I've seen from him. And again, final sort of bow here on the Eagles for this segment is the idea that the coaching is going to be under a microscope because the Eagles have now blown 4 leads within the final 2 minutes of a game since the start of the 2023 season, which is tied with the Falcons for the most blown leads in that time frame. If you're going toe-to-toe with the Falcons in terms of blowing leads, that is not a very good sign. So Falcons get a rejuvenating win here. We'll see if they're able to build on it, sort of what their next tests lie for them, but all in all, was a very entertaining game. Don't know if either team necessarily was excellent in this, but I still think that much needed win for the Falcons. And as for the Eagles, it's back to the drawing board a little bit, and they have a tough game ahead of them this upcoming weekend on the road against New Orleans. So we are going to be talking further about that Eagles loss and overall just the panic level that is surrounding them, as well as some of the other championship contenders that suffered losses over the course of the weekend. Have a little scale from 1 to 10 on how panicked these teams should be. So we're going to be diving into all of that, from the Eagles to the Cowboys to the Bengals and Ravens and all of those sort of championship contenders. But before we do so, we are going to take a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.